This here's a true story. It happened to a friend of mine who got tangled up with one of them big city insurance companies. This fella from the insurance company was always looking through the claims to see if anyone was trying to pull something. Well, one day he finds this old dirt farmer who had made an awful big claim. Seemed to have worse luck than a Bombay steak salesman. You know, fires, tornadoes, what have you. This insurance fella decides to drive on out to this farm and see what's what. Well, sure enough, the place is in real rough shape. He goes up to where the farmhouse used to be, and it's just a big pile of lumber, looking like it was pulled apart by some big wind. He looks around for the barn, but it's just mainly charred stumps and nothing but some makeshift shelters for the animals. All except the pig, who had this real purty, brand new sty. I tell you, that pig lived better than Ivana Trump. And that pig was in a beautiful, brand new electric wheelchair, which he needed, what with not having no hind legs or nothing. Which got that insurance fella thinking that maybe he had this farmer dead to rights. So he says, "Why don't you confess what's going on here with you and this pig?" The farmer kinda rears up and says, "Virgil ain't no dirty old pig. That pig is the smartest, the bravest, the most wonderful pig in the whole wide world." And he tells him how one night his whole family woke up to hear this pig grunting out in the yard. Grunting that woke the whole house up. Next thing he knows, there's this banging at the back door, like some giant mutant woodpecker. Of course, it brought the whole household downstairs just as that pig kicked the door in. So this farmer grabs his shotgun and is about to make some instant bacon when he notices there's a twister coming right for the house. The farmer got his family down to the storm cellar just before that twister came and leveled the house. Well, this insurance man is studying this farmer's face. He sure don't seem to be lying, but he still wants to know about that suspicious barn fire. Seems the old Guernsey kicked a lantern over, and that old barn lit up faster than a parson's nose on a Saturday night. There was no way that farmer could have got all the animals to safety by himself, but that pig pitched in and got all the animals out of there. Then just when they thought all the animals were safe, they hear this of baby chicks from inside the inferno. Without a thought for saving his own chops, this pig grabs hold of a burning rope, hoists himself up to that blazing hayloft, gathers up those chicks in his arms, and dives straight into the water tuck. A perfect double gainer. Except for the tuck, which wasn't great on account of him having pig legs. At least at the time he did. And the farmer explained he spent the insurance money on the wheelchair because he owed his life and the lives of all his animals to that pig. But there's just one more thing bothering the insurance man. How come that old pig don't have no hind legs? And that dirt farmer just looks this insurance guy right in the eye, very serious-like, and he says, "A pig that good, you don't eat all at once." That's a true story. Happened to a friend of mine. And you can only hope your next meal can do as much for you.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Ollie. He was the kind of guy who knew exactly which wine to order with chopped liver, or how long your tie should be so it didn't get caught in your fly. Oh, the girls were pretty sweet on Ollie. Heads turned whenever he came down the street. Now, it just so happened that Ollie was between adventures, a female, that is, when Imelda struck. Now, by all accounts, Imelda was one of the classiest dishes in town. You might say she was the mayonnaise in the tuna sandwich of life. Ollie jumped in front of Imelda and he said, "Dinner, tonight, le frite français, 8 o'clock. Imelda paused, and then she smiled that smile she had, and down the street she strolled, not looking back even once. Ollie wanted everything to go right with the evening, so he figured to show up early at Le Français, the fanciest restaurant in town. Ollie demanded the best table in the house, and fresh flowers, and a tablecloth. And are you ready for this? Clean cutlery! Oh, Ollie was starting to get up the nose of the maitre d', Max. You see, Max was also the owner, chef, and dishwasher at the Français, and nobody ever went to bed hungry being nice to Max. But Ollie didn't know that. Ollie told him that tonight was a very special night for him, and a very special lady, and that tonight, business as usual just wasn't going to be good enough. Max was just going to have to do a little bit better. Max thought for a moment, and then very calmly, very serenely, very graciously told Ollie that he was a fool for not realising Ollie was a man of the world, a man for whom the best is just regular fare. If Ollie would allow him, he'd prepare something special to delight and amaze Ollie and his lady fair. Max whisked off the tablecloth, applied a fresh one, lit the candle stuck in the wine bottle, and produced a basket of breadsticks. Ollie smiled appreciatively as Max dashed into the kitchen. Just then, Imelda entered. Oh, she was a vision in parachute silk. Imelda looked around and recognised Ollie instantly. The breadsticks stuffed up his nose were a dead giveaway. She laughed at his little joke, hoping those weren't the only breadsticks at the table. Meanwhile, Max was busy dumping old dishwater, the grotty stuff from the sink drain, and some coffee grounds into his special soup. Yes, Max had something very special planned for his surly customer and his important date. Then he snorted and hacked and hooked up just the thing. He gobbed it right into the centre of the soup. A loogie the size of a matzo ball bobbed in the bowl. It took a twist of parsley for garnish and called for a waiter. Gleefully, he peered through the door of the kitchen, watching as Ollie and his young date enjoyed the first course. When he saw Ollie look up and wave to him, Max couldn't resist going over to enjoy the moment more completely. But if you thought Max was stunned when Ollie told him it was the best soup he'd ever tasted, you should have seen his face when Imelda looked up from a bowl and said, "Daddy, this soup is delicious!" This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Ollie, and his father-in-law, Max, the ones who run that very successful restaurant. It's not just soup.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Stephanie's class was on a field trip to the farmland outside of town. They were going to visit the grape juice factory. She was very happy. Grape juice was Stephanie's favorite drink of all. She drank it every day with her breakfast, lunch, and supper. And now she was going to visit the factory. She wore her favorite purple dress for the occasion. The school bus pulled up to the door of the building and the kids piled out. Stephanie was so excited, she thought that she was going to burst. A nice man from the factory gave each kid a safety helmet and plastic safety goggles to wear. Then the tour began. They watched the trucks bring the grapes in from the farm. The grapes were dumped into a big bin where sprayers sprayed water all over them to wash them off. Then they went up, up, up on a conveyor belt to the mixer, where they got all squished up. The grapes, not the kids. Stephanie was a bit disappointed by this. She'd sort of imagined that there'd be people squishing the grapes with their feet, just like she'd seen on TV. But there was only a machine at the factory. It looked sort of like a giant kitchen mixer. It sure smelled good, though. Stephanie took a big sniff. She loved the smell of grape juice. Then they moved on to the filter room. The man from the factory explained that this was the place where the grape skin, seeds, and stems are removed. The grape juice splashed happily along through glass tubes, through the filter, and on to the next stop, the cooking vat. The nice man from the factory led the kids up a steep ladder to the top of the cooking vat. The vat was as big as a house. The kids walked along a creaky metal catwalk high above the bubbling juice. Stephanie stopped in the middle of the catwalk and let the other kids continue on with the tour. Her class climbed down the ladder on the other side of the catwalk and went into the packaging room. And then she was alone. She'd catch up to them in a sec. She just wanted to savor the moment. It smelled so great. I mean great. Purple clouds of grapey steam wafted up past Stephanie's nose. She shut her eyes so she'd remember this wonderful smell forever. This must be what heaven smells like, she thought. Then she heard a noise. She thought she was alone. But then Billy, the mean boy in her class, crept back up the ladder. Stephanie hated Billy. He stood at the far end of the catwalk, looking down into the bubbling vat. Then he took a deep breath and shut his eyes. Maybe he liked grape juice too, thought Stephanie. Maybe she'd misjudged him. Then Billy opened his eyes and looked around. He didn't see her in the darkness of the factory. What could he be doing, she wondered. Billy made a noise like he was clearing his throat. No, thought Stephanie. He wouldn't. He couldn't. He did. Billy horked a green loogie right into the vat. Then he laughed and scampered down the ladder before he got caught. Stephanie looked down, and as the greener dissolved into her grape juice, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Hey, it's a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And Stephanie, she got over it. And you know, the funny thing is, from that day on, she's never, ever touched another glass of grape juice again in her life.
Now, let's see.
Cockroach ain't been born that can outwit this maggot.
Oh, man, there's one born every minute. Hey, you know what? Let's have another story.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Jaxx loved the party scene. He was a club kid. Boy, that guy could party. He was a legend. He had a day job during the week, bicycle courier. I guess he had to pay for the partying somehow. There was an added benefit, though. With all that biking, he was in great shape. And I tell you, the guy was always checking his look in the mirror, genetically bias-sculpted. You know, never hair out of place. And know what? It paid off big time. The girls were all over him. He left a string of broken-hearted secretaries across the entire East Side. Use him and lose him. That was his motto, which I guess brings us to our story. Jaxx caught wind of the non-stop party up on the colony, New Macau. Word had it that Macau was the place to be. So he buzzed Willie and the troll, and they hopped the big bird to Party Central. Jaxx and company hit the club district like a house on fire. They were hot, and they knew it. People were calling to them from the doorways, you know, like, hey, you guys, why don't you come on in? The big debate was, which club would they honor with their presence? And so that's when Jaxx saw her. She was watching a sucker's wallet being lightened outside this little expatriate place. She was a hot little blonde number. She do. Jaxx slid up to her in the crowd. What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this? That's original, she said, cracking a funny crooked smile at him. He was hooked. You do? Come on. She danced her way past the gent engineer gorilla doorman with Jaxx in hot pursuit. He stood in the doorway of the club. Now, where'd she go? Then he saw her in the tangled mass of club kids and jack wiring halfway across the dance floor. She was waiting for him, swaying with the crowd and smiling that smile. He found some free earphones dangling from the overhead array. They plugged in. The oxuma filled his head. He glanced back across the room. Willie was getting chummy with a club girl, and the troll. The troll was comparing her tattoos with one of the gorillas at the door. Then Jack saw that the blonde was trying to tell him something. He couldn't hear her over the opsoma, so he took the phones off. She led him to a listening console and handed him another set of phones. Then she took a CD out of her purse and slid it into the console tray. "Why don't you try this?" sang it myself. Karaoke opsoma was the big thing on New Macau. The opera music filled his head. She adjusted his volume control, turned it way up, and then everything went black. Jaxx didn't know how long he'd been out. The pounding pain in his head woke him. Then, the door of the filthy hotel room came crashing open. Willie and the troll had been scouring New Macau looking for him for the last 2 days. Her eyes rolled up in her head and she passed out. Jaxx looked down at what she was pointing at. His body was gone. The blonde was a body snatcher. She'd stolen his body to sell for transplant parts and left him a prisoner, alive on a portable life support unit. Hey, it's a true story. Happened to a friend of mine. And Jaxx, he's giving up the party life. He's taking a desk job.
It's a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Oscar, a baggage handler who didn't have many friends. Not just because nobody likes the way the baggage handlers handle baggage, but also when something went wrong, Oscar would become a basket case. But the story actually started with Emily, this nice lady who had a Saint Bernard named Mozart, a very appropriate name since both the dog and the composer were dead. It was a sad day when Mozart passed on to the big fire hydrant in the sky. Emily decided to bury Mozart in the old family plot back home, way across the country. So she put him in an airline doggy shipping container, sent it off with the baggage, and she boarded the plane. Now, Oscar was doing what he always did, which was tossing luggage around. But when the doggy container containing one dead Saint Bernard came down the conveyor belt, Oscar didn't toss quite far enough. The container fell short, crashing to the floor. Oscar panicked. The other baggage handlers huddled around the container thinking that Oscar killed the dog. So the baggage handlers made up some fake problem to delay the plane from taking off to give Oscar time to replace the dead dog. But where do you get a Saint Bernard? Oscar unhooked the car from the front of the baggage tram, raced into town, and desperately searched for a live Saint Bernard. Oscar ran up one street and down another. A poodle here, a terrier there, cocker spaniels everywhere, but not a Saint Bernard in sight. Oscar tried the city pound, opening pens, desperately looking for a Saint Bernard. Oscar was totally out of control. He tried to put a leash on a sheep, but it still looked like a sheep. Oscar was exhausted, out of ideas and out of luck. But then he spotted the little boy standing in a driveway, crying and holding on to a Saint Bernard. It seems the boy's family was moving and he couldn't take the big old dog with him. A Saint Bernard who looked just like the one Oscar had killed. Almost. The dog in the container had a black spot on his nose. The boy's dog didn't, but Oscar took the dog anyway. He picked up a black magic marker on the way to the airport and made the Saint Bernard look just like Mozart. The dog, that is. And off flew Mozart II on his way to his new owner. The Saint Bernard was sure going to be surprised. So would his new owner. Picture this. There was Emily with her sweet mom and dad. They were pretty sad, prepared to plant old dead Mozart. Then here came the doggy container. It was moving. Something inside was shuffling around. Emily opened the container and out leapt Mozart! Emily fainted dead away. Mom and Dad thought their daughter had gone bonkers, imagining poor Mozart was dead. And when Emily came to, she convinced herself Mozart dying was all a bad dream. What else could it have been? This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And Emily is happy her Mozart is alive and looking better than ever, especially since his bath when the black mark on his nose disappeared.
Hi.
Be right back after this story. He wants the shell game.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, a guy named Frank. Now, Frank ain't what you'd call a rocket scientist. You could say he was a couple of clowns short of a circus. So, one day, Frank's wife had an urge for a navel orange. She was pregnant again and had all kinds of urges. She asked him to go to the store and get her an orange and some other stuff. Okay, so there's Frank, standing in the cereal aisle of the store reading labels on boxes. Frank's wife told him to make sure he checked the salt content of every cereal, because if there was too much salt, she'd retain water. Frank didn't know exactly what that meant, but it sounded ugly. He was concentrating so hard that he almost didn't see the little old lady next to him. "Would you be a dear and read this for me, Sonny?" she asked. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." So Frank read the label for her. "You're such a nice boy," she told him. Then she stared at him and said, "Thank you for your help," and was gone. A few minutes later, Frank was in the produce section looking for a good melon. Frank was knocking on his cantaloupe to test for freshness. "Excuse me." He couldn't believe it. The melon was talking to him. He was so shocked, he dropped it on the floor. Frank was really embarrassed, and he turned around to see if anyone was looking. And there was that old lady again. "I'm sorry if I startled you," she said. "Oh, it was you." Frank was relieved he wasn't hearing melons. The old lady was just staring at Frank. "Do I have something on my face or something?" No, it's just... Never mind. Sorry I bothered you," she said, and quickly wheeled her cart away. Next aisle over, Frank was trying to choose toilet paper. 2-ply or not 2-ply? He was really getting confused when there she was, staring at him. Frank was really getting the creeps, so he quickly steered his shopping cart around a display of pretzels and made for the frozen food section. He figured he'd be safe because it was way too cold for her old bones, but there she was again, giving him that stare. Frank pulled his cart into the checkout line, but the old lady got there first. "Pardon my staring," the old lady said. "You staring? I didn't notice." Frankie was trying to be cool. But then she started crying. "You look exactly like my long-lost son." Phew, she was just a sad old lady. "It's okay, lady, I understand." She kept on crying and crying. "You look exactly like him. Would you mind doing a poor old lady a favor?" "Anything," Frank said. This was really embarrassing. She asked Frank if he'd say goodbye, Mom, to her as she left the store. "It would make me feel so much better." Frank felt so sorry for the old lady, so he yelled out, "Goodbye, Ma, see you later." The "see you later" was his own idea. The cashier finished totaling Frank's bill. "That'll be $210.65. Frank said there must be some mistake. The only thing in his cart was a box of cereal and an orange with a funny dent in it. "Your mother said you'd be paying for hers, too." This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And Frank's wife doesn't send him out food shopping anymore. They can't afford it.
Okay, Maurice, you got the shell game.
Well, this looks like it's going to be easy to fool me.
Freaky story.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Mike was a stock boy at the local supermarket. It wasn't a bad job, as far as jobs go, but it was pretty boring. Loading groceries onto the shelves and sweeping the floors. Sometimes he'd help the checkout girls bag groceries. Not all the checkout girls, just the hot ones. Anyhow, one day Mike was stocking the shelves, following that old stock boy's rule of thumb of putting the fresh stuff at the back and the oldie moldies up front, when he was called to the checkout. One of the customers needed help carrying the groceries. This particular customer turned out to be a granny, and she had a ton of bags with her. Things were starting to look up. You see, another of the stock boys' rules of thumb was that the value of the tip is directly proportional to the number of bags to be carried. Mike picked up the old granny's bags and carried them out to the parking lot. That's when Granny confessed that she didn't have a car and asked if he wouldn't mind carrying the bags back to her place. "It's just around the corner," she said. It didn't take an Einstein to figure out that the old lady'd probably be so grateful she'd give him a really humongous tip. So Mike said, "Sure." So they started walking. That's when Mike realized that just around the corner was kind of an understatement. This granny lived at least a mile from the store and uphill all the way, through a strange, gingerbready kind of neighborhood. The whole place was like Granny City. "Not too heavy for you, is it, Sonny?" asked Granny. Mike, drenched with sweat, grunted and shook his head no. "Mind the eggs, dear," she said. They finally got to her house. Mike dragged the bags up the front steps. He put the bags on the kitchen table and then collapsed into a chair. He was totally wiped. That's when Granny said, "You've been so kind. Let me get you something for your time and trouble. I'll be right back." This is what he'd been waiting for. As the old lady scurried into the back room, she called out, "You must be hungry. Why don't you fix yourself a snack? There's lots to eat in the pantry." Mike was starving now that she'd mentioned it. He got up and opened the pantry doors. It was dark and musty, filled with jars of things like jellied calf's livers and pig's knuckles. What other weird stuff would he find? Something gross, maybe? He knew he should stop looking, but he couldn't help himself. He was hungry. He opened a cupboard door and it rolled out at him. He was scared, but he caught it. It was nothing weird at all. It was just a small jar of mixed nuts. He popped some of the nuts into his mouth. They were pretty good. Could have used some salt, but not too bad otherwise. They'd hold him till he found some real food. But there was nothing. Just jar after jar, shelf after shelf of yucky stuff like porpoise parts and monkey meat. Mike was getting the dry heaves just from looking at it. He decided to stick with the nuts, thank you very much. At least he knew nuts were safe. And before he knew it, he'd finished off the jar. Finally, Granny came back into the kitchen. "Here you go, dearie, something for your trouble." And she held out 15 cents. Mike took the money. "Gee, thanks, lady." Yeesh. All that work for nothing. But, on the bright side, he'd got a free snack out of it. "Oh, by the way," he said, "you had some mixed nuts in the cupboard? Sorry, I couldn't stop myself and I kinda ate them all." "Oh, that's all right, Sonny," Granny said with a kindly smile. "With the state of my teeth, all I can do is suck the chocolate off them anyway." Hey, it's a true story. Happened to a friend of mine. Yeah, Mike's still working at the supermarket, but he's added a new rule to the stock boys' rules of thumb. Never eat on the job.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. His name's Norman, but he called himself Slick. But he wasn't really. You see, Slick is the wussiest wuss in the freshman class at Hardy U. But almost from birth, Slick was brainwashed with spring break movies, having watched Animal House 72 times. So when Slick graduated from high school, Hardy was all he wanted. He joined the fraternity with the wildest rep, BGX, Beta Gimme Chicks. He even thought the pledge hazing was cool, the highlight of which was the panty raid. Slick and 3 other dweeb pledges got decked out in commando gear and set out for the sorority house with the hottest babes. The 4, salivating incompetents, scaled the ivy-covered walls, and there was a gaggle of sisters in one room doing toenails and hairdos. The pledges gaped through the window. "What? Slick spotted an empty room. The window wasn't locked. Slick slipped in and headed for the dresser. But then he heard, "Gotta get some sleep before that psych quiz." And Slick dove under the bed, just as Jody came into her room. Slick didn't move. He'd have to wait till Jody fell asleep before he could grab a pair of panties. But it would take an awful lot of patience because Jody was a super A+ student. And even though she had the psych book memorized, she decided to pull an all-nighter. Jody stayed awake and studied. Slick stayed under the bed and was dying. It must have been the corn dogs he ate, or the tortilla chips, or the super salty pretzels, whatever. It was making Slick pretty thirsty. But Jody would have to get up sometime to go to the bathroom. Gorgeous as she was still human. Oh yeah? By 4 a.m., Slick thought the inside of his mouth was lined with sandpaper. He had totally run out of spit. He needed water. He'd have to roll out and surrender. His dream lost for the need of a bit of water. How tragic. Fortunately, Slick was not as nerdy as he looked. Nobody could be that nerdy. Slick remembered when he was peeping into Jody's room, there was a glass of water on her night table. While she was absorbed in her books, ever so slowly, Slick's hand slid up the side of Jody's bed. Jody reached for a pencil, almost touching Slick's hand. The pencil rolled off the table, and when Jody reached down, Slick put the pencil into her hand. Jody was so into studying, she never noticed. So Slick made another try for the water. And he got it! Slow and easy. He took the glass down and had himself one big gulp. It's times like this that one tells God he will never participate in a panty raid. Unless, of course, he gets away with this one. By morning, Slick was still under the bed, and Jody was still memorizing every word of every psych book ever written. Finally, Jody packed it in. She swung her feet over the side of the bed and she screamed. The other girls rushed in. "My contacts," Jody said. "I put them in this glass of cleansing fluid on the night table and they're gone." This is a true story. Oh yeah, happened to a friend of mine, Norman. And since that all-nighter, he can really watch his diet, since his stomach is now wearing contacts.
Okay. It happened to a friend of mine. I remember when Ernie came into the arcade, asked to speak to the owner. Well, nobody would want to speak to Big Tony without wearing a gas mask. But Ernie needed a job real bad, see? Someone told Ernie that Big Tony had put an ad in the paper looking for a guy to work the change booth. Somebody had to tell Ernie that since Ernie couldn't read or write, which is why he didn't get the job. But Big Tony felt sorry for the little guy, so he gave Ernie one of those dumb prizes you win, big furry thing. Ernie took this big furry thing outside and all depressed, when this limo pulled up and a rich guy got out. Seems he forgot to get his kid a birthday present, so he gave Ernie $100 for the furry toy. Ernie figured some people would buy real weird things. So when he saw this guy throwing a broken table into a dumpster, Ernie gave the guy $100 for the table. Just then, this old guy steps out of an antique store and yells, "That's exactly what I've been looking for!" Turns out the table belonged to one of those French Louis Kings, and the old guy gave Ernie $1,000 for it. Ernie knew he was on the street when he saw a wreck of a heap of a pile of rust that was once a car. It had a for sale sign in the windshield, and Ernie paid $1,000 for this old rusty. Well, along came this scraggly, scrawny mutt to do his thing right in the car's rear bumper. Seemed the dog had no owner, so Ernie took him home, washed him up, and he brushed him out, and the mutt looked grand enough to enter the dog show and to win first prize, and $10,000. For some smart people, 10,000 would be a good quitting number. But Ernie took the 10,000 and bought a pickup truck. Then he took a ride and picked up a hitchhiker, a seedy old beard didn't smell. It didn't smell too good. But Ernie had a big heart. 2 days later, the old guy keeled over. He happened to be a billionaire. And he left Ernie $3 million. Enough to get through life in high style. But not Ernie. He bought himself an airplane. Not the most luxurious plane in the world, but it could fly with passengers to Acapulco and Nassau and all kinds of sunny places. Just when North America was hit with the coldest cold spell in decades. Ernie had to buy more planes, then a few cruise ships, and the island with all the hotels on it, then a few amusement rides for kids, and eventually, Ernie land. With all that money coming in, there's only one thing for Ernie to do: make movies. Ernie made blockbuster mega hits like Explosion 2, Explosion 3, and the classic Dinosaur Park! Ernie bought a TV network, newspapers, and a hockey team he called the Mighty Ernies. And on his 30th birthday, Ernie was interviewed for a magazine cover article. The reporter asked where he was born, what his dad did, what school he went to. Ernie admitted he'd never learned to read or write. The reporter said, "Oh, imagine what you would have become if you could read or write." Ernie replied, "A bookkeeper in a video arcade." This was a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And today, Ernie is finally learning to read, so we can take a newspaper into the bathroom, just like the rest of us.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. His name was Lorenzo, and he's dead. And he looks grand. I did him up personally. You see, Lorenzo had been a famous movie star when he was young, but alas, the only one who remembered he was in the cemetery mausoleum was his friend Basil, the old man who sat out front selling flowers from a little stand. One day, on the anniversary of Lorenzo's death, a mysterious woman dressed in black climbed up the hill to the cemetery and placed a single long-stemmed rose on Lorenzo's mausoleum step. A young photographer was in the cemetery at the time. He snapped some shots, and when he was about to leave, he realized that the old woman was gone. He ran to the gate of the cemetery, but the only one there was Basil. The photographer sold the picture to the local newspaper. The next day, 1,000 people showed up to see if the mysterious lady in black would come back. But nobody was there except Basil, who was pleased to sell out all his flowers for $1 apiece. A year passed. The photographer was now working at the local television station, and realizing it was the anniversary of Lorenzo's death, he brought a film crew to the cemetery. As expected, a mysterious woman dressed in black appeared and hovered near Lorenzo's mausoleum. She placed a single red rose on the steps. The photographer tried to interview the mysterious woman, but she was gone, disappeared. And when he ran to the gate of the cemetery, old Basil was sitting there reading a racing form. That night, the story was all over television. And the next day, 10,000 people showed up at the cemetery to see the mysterious woman and pay their respects to Lorenzo. And everybody was able to buy a flower from Basil at $2 each. Another year went by. The night before the anniversary of Lorenzo's death, the photographer sneaked into the cemetery and waited. Just as dawn was breaking, the mysterious woman in black returned and left a single red rose. At the gate, a vast number of people waited to buy roses from Basil, this year at $3 each. Poor Basil was so busy, the photographer decided to help. As things became more hectic, the photographer dropped some change behind the counter and noticed something. Basil was wearing women's black shoes, and on the shelf tucked away in back was a woman's dress, black, and a hat. veil, and sunglasses. The photographer said, "The woman in black?" Basil smiled. The photographer, desperate for the truth, swore he would tell no one. So Basil walked him to Lorenzo's mausoleum, where he opened the door. Inside was Lorenzo, and he sat up there in the crypt. Basil counted off half the money he made that day and handed it to Lorenzo. Then he turned to the photographer to explain. He gets half because it was his idea. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, but he's dead. And now so is his friend, old Basil, whom I did up equally well. And the photographer makes $40,000 one day a year dressing up like a lady and selling flowers.
About a story.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, an English professor whose heart was in the right place. He watched one student, Dave, practically salivate over this girl, Zoe, who sat in front of him. And Zoe, the professor thought, was kind of sweet on Dave. Well, it was spring, and the professor was feeling romantic. He teamed up Dave and Zoe to write a tandem story. One would start writing and stop when the egg timer ran out, and then the other would pick up where the first left off until time is up. Okay? Computer fired up. Time. Dave went first. He figured the way to Zoe's heart was the way to any girl's heart. Romance. So he started to write.
Carrie was confused. Was it eyes open and mouth closed, or mouth open and eyes closed? It was the most romantic moment of her young life. Her first meaningful kiss, and she didn't want to get it wrong.
Time. Now Zoe figured Dave is a guy, so to impress him, she'll go with the kind of story all guys like. Scary and gory. So he ripped off his enemy's arm. The blood dripped on Laszlo's shoe. But so what? He'd lick it off later. Right now, he was interested in the flesh he was holding in his hand. Time.
This is what she'd been waiting for. Being there, alone on the dock with her, Dan. He smiled at her and looked up into the glittering sky. Oh, there must have been a million stars. And when a shooting star streaked across the diamonds over their heads, he thought,
time. He was hungry for a snack before he delivered the brain to the evil doctor. He nibbled on a finger, spitting out the cheap brass ring. And Laszlo looked down into the grave, and an arm reached out. Time.
And tenderly wrapped around Carrie's soft shoulder. Her heart pounded. He wants me to be his girlfriend. And when he said he never felt this way before, Carrie melted into his arms.
Time. And smothered the life out of the body. At first, the eyes bulged wildly, but as the last breath left the corpse and the last drop of blood ran out, the whole body drew rigid. At that moment, Laszlo knew he would need fresh human organs to regenerate his monster. Time.
And make her the happiest girl in the world. Oh, Carrie's heart raced with excitement. The thought of being with this man who she loved so dearly was exhilarating. Her eyes sparkled, her face flushed.
Time. The professor glanced over their shoulders. Were they out of their minds? He had to call time and stop them, but at that very moment, the dean summoned him to his office. So Zoe went on. With the infusion of the synthetic serum, the monster's grotesque body twitched. Its green eyes oozed the excess fluid. Its mouth foamed as it rose on its haunches. All 6 hairy legs.
He loved every fiber of Carrie's being, and right there, under the stars, he kissed her and promised to be with her forever. Nothing he said
would ever force the monster to turn on him. But it did. In one swift move, the jaws of the beast severed Laszlo's head. Dave looked up from the computer and shouted, "You're sick, Zoe! Sick! Your mind is warped! Your sappy story would make a sugar plum fairy hurl. You have a twisted mind. You're swimming in honey and maple syrup. Your brain is a mangled mess. You should write with a pink feather quill. Will you go out with me?"
"I'd love to."
And they leaped into each other's arms. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. an English professor who gave up his teaching job to run a very profitable dating service.
Let's try.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Jerry. I guess he saw too many episodes of Space Mars, because sometimes you just gotta ask yourself, is it paranormal or am I just paranoid? He had this crazy idea there was a monster hiding everywhere. One evening, Jerry was taking his dog, Leonard, for a walk. When he went by that creepy old house on Mulberry Street, he peeked into the basement window. He wasn't a peeping Tom or nothing, but what he saw froze him dead in his tracks. The cellar was splattered in dripping fresh blood. Suddenly, the door of the house opened. Jerry and Leonard ducked down in the bushes. The guy was dressed in a tuxedo and a black silk cape, just like in the movies. Jerry fell in the dirt when he realized this guy wasn't just a killer, he was a blood-sucking vampire. Jerry and Leonard crawled out and started trailing him. The vampire went down the hill, dragging his big old suitcase. But they lost him when he got on the crosstown bus. Jerry could have gotten on with him, but dogs weren't allowed, and Leonard was, well, a dog. So they went home. Next night, Jerry brought Mickey and Pete. Mickey borrowed his dad's camera. They were going to get a picture of the vampire's butchering room. Then they'd be famous. Slowly, they made their way to the cellar window. The curtains were shut, but they heard this creepy, wet chopping sound. Something was going on in there, all right. A little while later, the door opened and the vampire stepped out, dragging his suitcase. Mickey was going to take the guy's picture, but Jerry stopped him. Everyone knew that you couldn't take a picture of a vampire. They'd turn out invisible. Besides, the flash would give him away. The vampire walked down the hill. That's when Pete whispered, "Hey, I know that guy. That's Mr. Alucard, the head waiter at that swanky restaurant across town. He's not a vampire. Everyone at that restaurant wears a tuxedo." Mickey was ticked. "The guy's a waiter? You dragged me down here to get a picture of a waiter?" It was getting late, so Mickey and Pete headed home. Some friends they were. He is a vampire! But the guys kept walking. Jerry hopped the next bus and got off outside the restaurant. It was getting late and Jerry didn't really have a plan, so he waved down a police car. The policeman asked him what he wanted. "There's a maniac vampire in there!" The police decided to check it out. "Good evening. I bid you welcome." It was the vampire. "That's him!" Jerry flashed the vampire with his camera. The officers quieted him down so they could talk to the vampire, who answered all their questions. Of course, he wasn't really a vampire. He wore the tuxedo because he worked there. And he made the house specialty, some sort of tomato juice from a secret recipe in his basement at home. Jerry told the men he was sorry and the police left. Mr. Alucard offered Jerry a glass of tomato juice. Jerry took a little sip. He sprayed the juice across the room. "This ain't tomato juice." "No, it's vegetable juice, extra spicy." Jerry took another sip. "You know, it's not bad." Then he finished his drink and went home. It's a true story. Happened to a friend of mine. Oh yeah, Mickey's dad took the film in to get developed. When he got it back from the photo place, there was nobody in the picture.
True story. It happened to a friend of mine. Dave works the graveyard shift. See, Dave's what you call a psychic investigator. And Dave's one of the good ones. That's why he was called to that place on Bonnie Meadow Road. The family had ghosts, and they had them bad. Their nice little suburban backsplit suddenly had a little life of its own. It started innocently enough, with the TV flicking on and off by itself. No big deal. Bad wiring. But then there were the ringing doorbells in the middle of the night, but nobody there. And then the oven door flying open and firing the roast chicken across the kitchen. And then the voice on the phone. The voice that kept telling Bob and Alice and their teenage son Richie that they could never leave the house alive. They hadn't slept in weeks. The noises and voices had ruined their lives, ruined their health, and were ruining the house's value at just about the time they decided to put their place up for sale. Nobody was really interested in a place with walk-in closets, central air, and wall-to-wall ghosts. Dave went to work. He would spend the night alone in the house. For Dave, step 1, ascertain the house is empty. Step 2, check the fridge for leftovers. Dave sat down to a great meal of leg of lamb, potato salad, cold pizza, and beer. Step 3, nap time. Steps 4 through 10, wait until it got dark. About 9 o'clock, Dave hooked up his plasmometer and took readings throughout the house. Negative. No recordable ghostal presence. Dave did a standard wall check. No discernible space-time warps. So Dave set some spectrum analysis codes on his apparition apparatus and settled in to watch the bowl game. 11:08 p.m. The TV began to change channels randomly. He saw nothing unusual except that the Cubs had actually won a game. 2:03 a.m. Dave is awakened by the doorbell. He opened the front door and found nothing there. This happened every 5 minutes for an hour. Once Dave came across something of note. At 2:48 a.m., his pizza arrived, but the anchovies were missing. 3:15 a.m. During a phone call to his office to check messages, Dave felt another life force on the line. The disembodied voice yelled into the phone, "Dave, get the heck out of my house." 4:52 a.m. On his way to the bathroom, Dave passed a family picture in the hallway. Red liquid poured from the necks and hearts of a smiling Bob and Alice and Richie. 7:16 a.m. An exhausted Dave stumbled into the kitchen to make some breakfast. The toaster shot charred blackened toast into his forehead. At 8 a.m., Bob and Alice showed up. Dave led them to the basement, to a tiny door covered with cobwebs hidden behind the furnace. Dave kicked open the door to reveal Richie with an extension phone, the TV remote control, and the house's electrical control panel open and rewired. "There," said Dave, "is your ghost." Sob, sob, anger, anger, as Richie explained how he didn't want to move and sabotage the house so they could stay in the neighborhood. As Dave was leaving the house, he told Richie he'd done a pretty good job for an amateur, especially the bleeding picture. That's the mark of a real haunted house. "What bleeding picture?" asked Richie. This is a true story. Happened to a friend of mine, Dave, who used to be one of the great psychic investigators, although now, for some reason, he prefers to sell real estate.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Sam. Her actual name was Samantha, and she was a friend back when we both were 10. I liked Samantha because she was always full of surprises. She was different. I mean, in a lot of ways she was regular, but in some ways she was really, really different. Like when the new kid moved in next door to her. Devlin was his name, nasty little guy. When Samantha would go out on her bike, Devlin would zip by on his skateboard real close. So Samantha would get startled and swerve and bump into a tree or something and fall. And what would Samantha do? Nothing. She didn't run home crying, didn't tell Devlin's mother. Like I said, she was different. And when Devlin had one of his nasty pals at his house, Devlin would swipe something of Samantha's, like her hat or her scarf. And then Devlin and his pal would play monkey in the middle. You know, they'd toss it back and forth while Samantha would make pitiful attempts at grabbing it. And Devlin thought that was hysterical. He'd laugh and tease and act like a jerk. Still, Samantha did nothing. It could have been a good strategy if Devlin was a regular kid and just gave up when he didn't get Samantha's goat or make her cry. But no, Devlin kept being annoying and Samantha kept doing nothing. But everybody has a limit of how much they can take. And Devlin pushed Samantha past that limit the day he went after Samantha's cat with a water gun. Samantha went ballistic. It was time to get even. Which was not too much of a challenge for Samantha since She was a witch. Samantha went into her witch mode, conjured up a bolt of lightning, and sent it right toward Devlin's house, and it came right back at her. She thought it must have hit something. Maybe Devlin's house had aluminum siding. No problem. Samantha was way more than a one-trick witch. Samantha flipped through witch books, found a recipe for fireballs, and before you could say, "Trouble, trouble, boil and bubble," she had a fireball the size of a Buick. With all her might, she hurled it at Devlin's house. And what came back at Samantha was a huge torrent of water. It doused the fireball and nearly drowned Samantha. She figured someone must have been watering the lawn or washing the car, whatever. Samantha had a whole bunch of witch books full of tricks. And it was time to pull out some of the really scary stuff. Actually, the scariest of all the big snakes. Snakes always work. Even small ones can be scary. But the one Samantha conjured up was a monster, a mega snake. So over goes the giant snake slithering across the yard. Samantha sat back and waited for Devlin's pitiful scream, which never came. What did come was her giant snake in a panic. And no wonder. Right behind the snake was a great big saber-toothed tiger. That giant jungle cat chased the snake across Samantha's yard, crashing through the fence, disappearing down the street. Well, she had to find out what was going on. So that night, when she was sure everyone in Devlin's house would be asleep, she snuck across the yard. She crept up to the window of Devlin's room and peeked in. No one was in the room. Then Samantha smelled something familiar. She couldn't quite figure out what it was. It was just familiar. Familiar in a nice way. Like when a boy remembers exactly where he was when he smelled his first pizza. Suddenly, it hit her. It was the smell of school. Witch school. Boiling gnat's wings and powdered bat nails. All that magic potion stuff she knew so well. In Devlin's house? "Hi," said Devlin, suddenly standing right behind Samantha. "How did you get here?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Devlin was a warlock. This was a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Samantha. She got to know Devlin, got to like him, eventually married him, and they had a child who could be your next-door neighbor.